let's wrap this up with one big question. This is a podcast for men. Do you put you on the spot? I don't know if you have an answer to this or not, or if it's so simple. Do you see one big issue amongst the men, whether it's solo or as part of a couple? Is there something that you can pinpoint at or point to and say, boy, that's a big issue that guys are dealing with right now in the world of relationships that we really need to get on top of?
Well, the trend that I see that I've discussed in a podcast, this is among younger men specifically, so I would say under 40 for sure, is that their work is not considered to be really worthy of even any sort of discussion. And they're supposed to do, so even if they're in stay at home, married to a wife who's staying at home, whether temporarily or permanently, their work is considered somewhat of a distraction. And then they get home and they're immediately supposed to do half, if not more, of the childcare and the housework in order to compensate for the time that they took for themselves outside the house to earn a living. And that is, I said in my podcast that younger working husbands are condescended to the way that stay-at-home moms used to be condescended to. It's almost like that's your stuff that you do for you on the side, irrespective of whether it's a sole income or not. You know, and then the meat of this family is the stuff, you know, the real important stuff is what happens when you walk in. So the pendulum like fully swung. It used to be that that men looked down on women and said, what are you doing with the kids all day, eating bonbons? Why isn't this house picked up? And that, in fact, even just 10 years ago when I started doing my blog, I was seeing much more of that. Now it's like, it veered to the other side among unhealthy couples. And she's like, what were you doing at the office? Just sitting there, you know, looking at your phone? Here's where I was teaching our children about emotional vulnerability, you know, and taking them to their hobbies. And so it's almost like the work is very much condescended to in the way that not working used to be, which is kind of mind blowing. But it is certainly a trend that I see.
Where do you think the origin of that trend is?
Things just flip.
The pendulum swing. It's a reaction to we've been belittled as women all these years.
And now it's like, well, men should be condescended to, you know, and nobody should be condescended to, you know.
Along this theme, I posted a video saying, all the years I've done this, the one thing that I see really pisses women off is to hear a man say, no matter in what good spirit it came, you know, he comes to his wife, hat in hand, tears in his eyes, and he just says, I feel like I'm forgotten ever since we had children. Like I feel completely thrown by the wayside. I have no say in anything. We're not connected as a couple anymore. Like I miss my wife. I miss my best friend. And just, I feel like, you know, go do your job, dummy, and get out of my hair. And men are very hurt by this. Very common sentiment amongst a lot of men. And women, instead of going, oh, well, that's not my intent. I'm sorry I did that to you. You know, I'm just so overwhelmed with the kids and everything. Instead, the reaction is one of downright anger, like just the most visceral anger you can imagine. I have thousands of comments on said video. And I thought, what an interesting phenomena.
Yeah. Well, it is very interesting because of how wildly it would be different, you know, by time that is set. The more narcissistic men will say that it's 6 weeks. She's literally still bleeding, you know, from the delivery. And he's like, you know, it's been a while that you've not focused on me. And then it's like, the baby just came out of my body. And so that is a very, very different situation from a guy who at 3 years postpartum is saying, perhaps now it's time to go on date nights. And she's like, what kind of monster are you? Like, do you not put the baby first? So there's a wide spectrum. So obviously, if it was a hot button topic, you were probably getting a lot of the many women whose husbands were even pushing for sex before 6 weeks, which happens. And, you know, so those guys need to work on being more empathic. However, on the other side, I've seen people who it's like, we haven't gone out for a date since the baby was born. How old's the baby? He's 10, you know? And so it is wildly different. It is not ever going to happen that a woman puts a man before the children. And most men don't want that. Most healthy men don't want that. Although men who were not prioritized as children do worse with that, because then they feel like, when is it ever my turn? That's kind of not her problem in a sense, because the real issue is the unresolved childhood trauma. But just because she would get the kids out of a burning building and not him does not mean that she doesn't also love him. If she can't show that she also loves him, then that's certainly something to work on. She's never going to pick him. She's never going to give him a kidney and not the children, and she is going to give them a kidney and not him. But that doesn't mean that she can't love him and be like a loving mother and a loving wife. A loving mother and a loving wife is great. Some men want a loving wife before a loving mother. That's rare, but that is more guys with issues, right? But most guys say, okay, cool, they're at the top. Can I be on the list though? Like I want to be on the list, you know?
Yeah.
And that's a totally
That's
normal
what I was getting
thing.
at. Yeah, and that's what a lot of men feel. It's like, I'm not even on the list anymore. And you know, I'll hear the thing, and it sounds very typical feminine quality, is I'll hear men complaining about in our group, like our 10-year anniversary came and went. She didn't even make any kind of acknowledgement of it whatsoever. I bought her this, I bought her that. Let's do this. And she's like, maybe, I don't know. And she just, the day came and went, and she acted like she couldn't be bothered. And that's the general theme to the relationship, is one of that part of our relationship is over. Don't you realize it, dummy? We're parents now. And it hurts a lot of men to hear that. And, you know, going back to the post about men are so hurt by the disconnect after the baby, there were comments from women about the sex thing, but more often than not, the comments, going back to your previous story, was, I'll tell you what's going on. It's the fact that this dummy doesn't do anything around the house. The entire weight of the domestic whatever falls on my shoulders as woman. That's why I forget about him. Maybe if he did more around the house. And I always come back with, I hear you. If you had some asshole that's sitting on a couch just playing video games, well, duh, get him off his ass and say, chop, chop, let's go. We got stuff to do. But I don't see that in my world.
In your world, certainly not. But it is there. It is there.
It exists, so sure.
We get all of those preoccupied people, the men and the women, and they're all partner to avoidance. And so they all have the same problems. They just don't, they just think it's a gender problem, but it's really a preoccupied person with an avoidant person problem.
But I think regardless of temperament, avoidant, whatever, I think there's a major cultural shift, and has been for quite some time, that men are more domestic than ever.
Oh, yes, certainly.
Every man I know cleans. Every man I know takes kids everywhere. Every man I know reads bedtime stories.
Like goes to like, though, Ralph. You do a lot of stuff, so they do a lot of stuff. Your friend, you're not going to be friends with a man who sits on his ass.
Exactly. So that's, and I always say that in my thing, maybe that's just my social group, and that's my world that I belong in. And maybe there are pockets of this world.
Doctor, she's not going to marry that. I mean, it's like a whole thing. But the point being, there are guys, but the amount of the guys who do nothing is shrinking. So when I actually do like an inventory of who does what, and he's doing at least half, and she says he's not, then that's often an over-functioning problem, or a maternal gatekeeping problem, or an anxiety problem on her side that needs to be explored. Not that he's blameless. He may be really annoying in other regards, but she is also, and everybody has their own stuff to work. I've never met a couple yet where I'm like, it's just one of you. It's never just one.
In the case of all these men married to these avoidant women who have these narcissistic tendencies and so forth, they like to do the whole, look what an evil witch she is, and she's, done all these bad things. I say, well, there's a reason you got with a person like this. Yeah. And there's a reason you stayed with a person like this.
It's self-fulfilling prophecy. It's confirmation bias. If you think all women are terrible, then you find yourself the worst one, and you make your whole life around climbing up and being a martyr on the cross about how terrible she is. And that is also deeply unhealthy, obviously.